Madison Blake had laughed the day Carter Miller walked away with a scorched Ferrari for scrap money. To her, it was nothing but a rusting eyesore rotting in her late father's garage, something to be cleared, forgotten, sold for whatever someone would take. But 6 months later, when that same car appeared gleaming beneath the auction lights, Madison felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't just a rare Ferrari worth millions. It was hiding a family secret she had discarded without a second thought. Madison came back demanding it. Carter already held something she could never buy. Stay with this story until the end, because the true value of that Ferrari had nothing to do with its engine. The Blake estate sat at the end of a long gravel drive in the hills east of Sacramento, California, the kind of address that suggested old money and older regrets. The main house, a sprawling Spanish colonial with terracotta roofing and iron-framed windows, had been maintained through decades of hired hands, but now it wore the look of a place that had finally stopped pretending. Joseph Blake had died 7 weeks prior, quietly and without much ceremony, leaving behind a daughter, a pile of legal paperwork, and a garage he had locked with a key no one else had ever bothered to copy. Madison Blake arrived on a Tuesday morning with a real estate agent, a moving crew, and the specific kind of efficiency that comes from grief compressed into task lists. She was 32 years old, sharp-shouldered, and dressed in clothes that belonged in a different zip code. She had not slept in her childhood bedroom in over a decade. The garage was the last thing on her list, and she approached it with the same detachment she had applied to everything else. When the padlock finally gave and the double doors swung open on rusted hinges, the smell hit her first: motor oil, old leather, and something acrid beneath it all, like a memory that had burned and never quite aired out. Inside, wrapped in shadows and a thick fur of dust, sat a Ferrari. The car crouched low to the ground at the far end of the garage. Its red paint bubbled and blackened along the passenger side, the windshield cracked in a long diagonal fracture, the driver's seat split open and the interior foam collapsed into itself. One rear wheel was propped on a wooden block. The hood was ajar, bent at the front as though something had once struck it from inside. Madison stared at it for a moment, then told the agent she wanted it gone by the end of the week. The listing went up on an automotive salvage board by that afternoon. The price was set low enough to guarantee a quick response, and low enough to make clear that Madison had no interest in negotiation. She had made a few calls first to a couple of dealerships, to someone her father's attorney knew, but none of them wanted a burned wreck with questionable paperwork. Carter Miller responded within the hour. He arrived the following morning in a faded blue pickup with a flatbed trailer hitched behind it, an 8-year-old girl in the passenger seat with a braid coming loose on one side and a library book balanced on her knees. His work clothes were clean but worn, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who spent most of his life on his feet. Madison watched him from the front steps as he walked the length of the garage, crouching beside the car, running his fingertips along the sill and the undercarriage, pressing his palm flat against the firewall. His daughter climbed down from the truck and stood in the driveway, watching her father with the patient interest of someone who had done this before. Carter didn't rush. He tilted the hood further open, studied the engine bay, and then straightened and pulled a small flashlight from his shirt pocket to examine the plate on the firewall. Madison checked her phone twice while he worked. She didn't ask what he was looking at. When he finally crouched to look at the chassis from below, she crossed her arms and waited. What Carter saw in those quiet minutes was not what Madison imagined. She assumed he was estimating salvage weight, calculating how much aluminum and steel he could pull off the carcass and sell by the pound. Instead, Carter was reading a story. The chassis number stamped into the firewall was not a standard production sequence. The badge on the engine cover, though tarnished, was an original factory emblem rather than a replacement piece. The intake manifold had been machined to a specification Carter had seen only in photographs, and the body seams on the undamaged quarter panel ran with a precision that mass production lines did not produce. Whoever had built this car had built it for someone specific. Carter asked Madison one question: how long had it been in the garage? Madison said she didn't know, probably since before she was born. The sale took less than 10 minutes. Carter signed the paper Madison's agent had prepared, loaded the car onto the flatbed with the care of a man transporting something irreplaceable, and cinched the straps carefully. Before he climbed back into the truck, Madison leaned against the gatepost and said that if he wanted, He could always weld it into a planter. It was about as useful as a garden ornament at this point. She did not say it meanly. Exactly. But she did not say it kindly either. Carter didn't respond. His daughter, Ella, looked up at him from the passenger window and asked why he was buying a car that looked like it had been on fire. Carter buckled his seatbelt, glanced once in the rearview mirror at the estate disappearing behind them, and told her that some things just needed someone with enough patience to look twice. He pulled out onto the main road, and behind him, Madison Blake walked back into her father's house without once looking at the empty space in the garage. That empty space was about to become the most important thing she had ever given away. Carter Miller's shop occupied a converted industrial bay on the south side of Fresno, tucked between a tire distributor and a chain-link fence that backed up against a dry creek. The sign above the roller door read Miller Restorations in hand-painted letters that had faded to the color of old brick. Behind the main workspace, separated by a plywood partition with a window cut into it, was the place where Carter and Ella actually lived: 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a small table pressed against the wall where Ella did her homework while her father worked on the cars. It was not the kind of arrangement Carter had ever planned, but plans had a way of dissolving on you, and what remained after the dissolving was what you actually were. Claire Miller had died 3 years earlier from a brain aneurysm that gave no warning and asked for no permission. She had been 31. One morning she was making coffee and asking Carter whether he thought Ella needed new school shoes, and by that evening she was gone in a way that left no room for gradual adjustment. Carter had shut down for about 6 weeks, during which his sister came to stay and Ella learned to be quieter than a child her age should have to be. Then Carter got back up, not because the grief had passed. It hadn't, not really, but because Ella needed lunch packed and the shop's 2 ongoing projects needed finishing, and the world had a mean habit of moving forward whether you were ready or not. He got up, and he kept working. His reputation in the restoration community was modest but solid. He did not advertise heavily, did not maintain a polished professional presence or attend industry events. What he had was word of mouth from people who had brought him impossible problems and received cars that ran better than they had in 40 years. His principle was simple and non-negotiable. He did not alter a vehicle's original character. He repaired, he preserved, he corrected what wear had done, but he did not reinvent. If a car had left the factory with a certain transmission, it left his shop with that same transmission restored rather than replaced with a modern retrofit. Carter considered this a matter of honesty, and he applied it with the stubbornness of someone who had learned the hard way that shortcuts always showed up eventually. Ella loved the shop in the way children love places they have been allowed to belong to fully. She knew the names of most of the tools, could distinguish the smell of penetrating oil from transmission fluid, and had her own set of rags folded on the lowest shelf beside the parts washer. She believed, with a seriousness that Carter never mocked, that every old car carried a kind of interior life, not mechanical but emotional, a residue of every road it had traveled and every hand that had driven it. When Carter brought the Ferrari in on the flatbed, Ella walked around it 3 times without touching it, then declared that it was very sad but not broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. Carter told her that was probably the most accurate assessment the car had received in years. The disassembly revealed more with every layer Carter removed. The suspension geometry was race specification, fitted with components not offered in any standard production option for this model year. The electrical harness, charred as it was, had been routed through the cabin in a configuration Carter had to track down through a collector in Arizona who specialized in mid-century Italian coachwork. The man couldn't identify the configuration from memory, but recalled seeing something similar in a private commission documented in a catalog from the early 1970s. Carter ordered the catalog. It arrived 9 days later. On page 43, between a silver-blue coupe commissioned for a Swiss banker and a black convertible built for a film producer, was a brief entry, no photograph, just a notation describing a special order coupe finished in Rosso Corsa with a bespoke interior, commissioned by an American client as a private gift. The catalog gave no name. While Carter was working evenings under the car with a trouble light hooked to the chassis, Ella found something in the rear footwell that had survived the fire because it had fallen between the seat base and the carpet, insulated by the thick seat padding above it. It was a photograph, small and square in the format of 1970s instant prints, its colors faded to soft amber. A man in his 30s stood beside the car, unmistakably this car, unblemished and brilliant, with his arm around a woman who was laughing at something off-frame. Between them stood a small girl, perhaps 4 years old, squinting in direct California sunlight. The man's face was thin and precise, with the kind of jaw that photographs well. Carter didn't know who he was looking at. He set the photograph on his workbench and looked at it for a long time. Meanwhile, Madison Blake was moving forward in the way she always moved, directed, and just slightly too busy to sit still long enough for anything uncomfortable to surface. She had sold the estate within 3 weeks of Joseph's death and put the proceeds into a luxury fashion import venture she was co-developing with a partner in Miami. The project suited her, it was visible, profitable, and had nothing to do with garages or California hills or fathers who had spent more evenings in their driveways than at dinner tables. She told herself she didn't think about the Ferrari, and she told herself this with the practiced confidence of someone who had become very good at not noticing the things that pulled at her. Carter, facing mounting bills from the parts distributor and an overdue equipment lease, was visited one evening by a man named Logan Harris, who operated a used parts brokerage out of a warehouse in Bakersfield and arrived with a straightforward proposition: strip the Ferrari for components, sell the original Italian specification parts to the collector market, and walk away with enough to clear every outstanding debt in Carter's ledger. Carter listened to the full pitch. Then he told Logan no. Logan left shaking his head. Carter went back to work. The restoration of the Ferrari was not a single project but 100 smaller ones nested inside each other like the layers of something geological. Carter sourced the original wheel specifications from a specialist in New Jersey who had spent 20 years cataloging Italian coachwork variants. He fabricated a replacement section of the rocker panel using period-correct steel he found through an import contact in Pennsylvania, hammering and shaping it over a custom buck until the profile matched the undamaged side within a fraction of a millimeter. The glass had to be tempered to a curved specification that no off-the-shelf supplier could fulfill, so Carter contracted a custom glazier in Phoenix and made 2 trips out there over the course of a month to supervise the work. Every decision cost money he didn't quite have yet. He made each one anyway. The nights were the productive hours. After Ella had done her homework, eaten dinner, and been put to bed, Carter returned to the car under the cold overhead lights with a thermos of coffee and a level of concentration that probably looked, from the outside, like stubbornness. He worked through problems methodically. When a fitting didn't match, he researched until he understood why and then found the component that did. When a system behaved unexpectedly, he traced it back to its origin rather than patching over the symptom. The car was beginning to respond to attention the way a horse responds to a calm hand, cautiously at first, and then with something approaching willingness. It was on one of those late nights, about 3 months into the project, when Carter removed the center console and discovered the anomaly. The console was original to the car but had been bolted into position with a fastener pattern that didn't correspond to the mounting points on the floor. Carter loosened the assembly and lifted it free, expecting to find a wiring shortcut or some previous owner's amateur modification. Instead, he found a cavity in the floor pan that had been deliberately formed and sealed. The seal was a fire-retardant fiberglass compound, applied with professional precision. Whatever was inside had been placed there with the intention of surviving damage that the car itself might not. Carter broke the seal carefully, working around the edges with a heat gun and a thin blade. Inside was a metal envelope, roughly the size of a large index card, constructed from material that had indeed survived the fire with only superficial discoloration. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a set of original factory build sheets for the car, stamped and signed by the coachwork house, a folded design sketch on drafting paper showing an interior configuration that matched precisely what Carter had been rebuilding, and an unsealed letter, handwritten in a careful, educated hand on personal stationery. The letterhead read Joseph R. Blake. The letter was addressed to no one by name. It began, "Simply, if you are reading this, then the car survived and I did not." Carter sat on the shop floor and read the letter twice through. Joseph Blake had written it sometime in the mid-1990s, not long after an event he described in careful, measured language that carried the weight of a man who had spent years trying to find the right words for something that resisted them. The account was this: Joseph had commissioned the Ferrari in the early 1970s as a gift for his wife on the occasion of their first wedding anniversary. He had ordered it specially, with the interior configured to her taste and with a small inscription worked into the dashboard trim that referenced a private phrase between them. The car had been kept in the garage at the family estate, driven only occasionally, and maintained as something between a keepsake and a promise. It was the most deliberate thing Joseph Blake had ever made. The trouble had come when Madison was 5 years old, on an evening when a fire broke out in the garage as the result of a faulty electrical connection in the structure's wiring, not the car's. Joseph had been inside the garage when it started. His wife, who had gone to get their daughter from the house, arrived back to find the garage already in serious flames, with Joseph trapped inside because the rolling doors mechanism had jammed. Joseph had used the Ferrari, the car he had built for her, the car that carried their inscription, to ram the door open from inside, driving through the burning structure to escape, and the passenger side had caught the worst of the fire in doing so. He had survived. The garage had not. What had broken the family was not the fire itself, but the aftermath. Madison's mother, shaken and frightened, had accused Joseph in the raw clarity of shock of caring more about the car than his family, of risking their safety to save an automobile. Joseph had tried to explain that he had been trying to save himself, to get to them, that the car was the only means of breaking the sealed door. But grief and fear produced their own logic, and the explanation had not taken root. The marriage had unraveled over the following year, and Madison had grown up with her mother's version of events, a father who had chosen the Ferrari over his family. Joseph had written the letter because he had never managed to say the truth in person. He had hidden it in the car, the only witness, in the hope that someday, someone would find both. Carter stared at the photograph on his workbench. The little girl squinting in the California sunlight was Madison Blake. He thought about the way she had looked at him in the driveway, not with cruelty, exactly, but with the dense, practiced dismissiveness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had stopped noticing it because putting it down had never seemed like an option. Ella found him still sitting on the floor past midnight and asked what was in the envelope. Carter told her he had found a letter from a father to a daughter. Ella considered this and said that it must have been important if he hid it inside a car. Carter said yes, he thought it probably was. She told him that sometimes people said things better when they had time to think about how to say them right. And Carter looked at his daughter in the pale workshop light and thought, not for the first time, that she was significantly wiser than he was. Within a week, word reached Xavier Coleman. Xavier operated as an independent broker in the classic car market, working the gap between motivated sellers and motivated buyers with a facility for finding transactions that benefited primarily himself. He had a contact in the collector community who had seen Carter's initial inquiry about the Ferrari specifications and connected the dots. Xavier called Carter to express admiration for the project and his conviction that several of his clients would be very eager to participate. Carter thanked him and said he hadn't decided yet what he intended to do with the car. Xavier took this as an opening rather than a closed door, and that same evening he placed a call to a number he had tracked down through the estate's probate records. Madison Blake picked up on the third ring. Madison arrived at the shop on a Friday afternoon without an appointment. Carter heard the car pull in, a late-model European sedan that was clean and precise and had no business in this parking lot, and came out to find Madison standing in front of the roller door in a cream-colored blazer, looking at the building the way people look at things that have disappointed them by existing. She had let her hair down since the day at the estate, and she carried herself with the composed tension of someone who had prepared very carefully for a conversation, and was now executing it without quite as much certainty as she had rehearsed. Carter wiped his hands on a shop rag and waited. Madison got to the point without a prologue. She wanted to buy the Ferrari back, and she named a figure 10 times what Carter had paid at the estate with the flat confidence of someone unaccustomed to being told no. Carter said no. Madison recalibrated. She said she was prepared to be flexible on price, that she understood he had put significant work into the car, and she wanted to compensate him fairly. Carter said the price wasn't the issue. Madison asked what the issue was. Carter said he wasn't ready to sell. Madison's composure developed a fine crack. She said that she had made an uninformed decision when she sold the car, that she hadn't understood what it might be worth, and that it was difficult for any agreement to be truly valid when one party was operating without complete information. Carter looked at her steadily and said that she had called it a piece of junk. She had offered it at scrap price. He had inspected it carefully and paid what she asked. The law tended to see it the same way. Madison said she would have her attorney look at the paperwork. Carter said she was welcome to do that. Ella had been inside when Madison arrived, but she came through the side door mid-argument carrying a glass of water she had been bringing to her father. She stopped and looked at the two adults with the calm, assessing gaze of a child who had learned to read rooms. She looked at Madison for a moment and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than rudeness, why she wanted to take back something she had said she didn't want. Madison opened her mouth and then closed it again. It was not a question she had prepared for. Ella waited a moment, decided the grown-ups needed time, and went back inside. The question remained where it had landed. Madison did consult an attorney, and the attorney reviewed the bill of sale, the condition report Carter had photographed before loading the car, and the listing price, and told Madison that the transaction was clean. She had set the price. She had signed the paperwork. She had watched the car leave. The attorney said Madison could pursue a claim of material misrepresentation if she could demonstrate that Carter had concealed knowledge that would have changed the transaction, but that would require proving he had known what the car was before he bought it, which the available evidence did not support. Madison fired the attorney and hired another one who reached the same conclusion. Meanwhile, Madison found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, going through boxes. She had kept a storage unit in Palo Alto where she had placed her childhood belongings when her mother sold the family house. She found the boxes on a Saturday morning and began opening them, and inside were the ordinary artifacts of a California childhood in the 1980s: report cards, birthday cards, books, a box of photographs she had always meant to organize and never had. She found one particular photograph near the bottom of the second box. It was a large studio print showing her parents on a formal occasion, with a very young Madison between them. Her father was looking at the camera. Her mother was looking at her father. Madison, perhaps 3, was looking at nothing in particular with the serene inattentiveness of someone not yet old enough to carry interpretations. There was something in her father's expression that Madison had missed when she was young and was not equipped to see. He was not looking at the camera comfortably. He had the expression of a man who was trying very hard to show the right thing. Madison sat on the storage unit floor for a while and thought about the last time she had actually spoken to her father, not argued, not exchanged logistics through attorneys, but spoken. She couldn't find it. Xavier called twice in the week that followed, suggesting she simply outbid Carter at market when the time came, framing it as reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Madison listened and told him she would think about it. She was thinking about something else entirely, about a road trip her father had promised when she was perhaps 7, all the way up the Pacific coast to Oregon, a trip they had packed a bag for and gotten as far as the end of the driveway before her father's phone rang and the promise dissolved into a rescheduled, maybe that never became a date. She had decided at 7 that cars mattered more to him than she did. She had never found a reason to revise that conclusion until now. The Ferrari was finished on a Wednesday in late November, 9 months after Carter had strapped it to his flatbed in the driveway of the estate. He did not finish it with ceremony. He drove it slowly around the block twice, listening, feeling the way it moved through its gears and settled into its geometry, noting nothing that required further attention. Then he parked it back in the shop and sat with it for a while in the quiet. It was a remarkable piece of machinery. The restoration had not made it new, it was not new, and Carter would not have wanted it to be. What it was now was fully itself again, scarred in the places where history had marked it, sound in every functional way, and possessed of a quality that well-executed restorations sometimes achieved and often didn't, which was the quality of a thing that had been through something and come out on the other side with its character intact. The Sonoma Concours was a collector car exhibition and charitable auction held annually at a winery estate north of San Francisco, and Carter had secured a display spot 3 months before the car was finished. His intention was not to sell. He needed a public verification of the car's provenance, a formal inspection by credentialed experts who could examine the build sheets, the chassis documentation, and the physical evidence of the coachwork commission and confirm, on record, what Carter already knew from his own research. By noon on the day of the event, 3 separate specialists had found their way to the car without prompting and were standing around it talking in the precise, lowered tones of people confronted with something that requires careful language. By early afternoon, the event's senior authentication expert had spread Carter's build sheets on a folding table, compared them against his reference materials, and said, quietly, that this was the commission listed in the 1973 catalog addendum, the one that had been listed as destroyed in a property fire. He said it with the tone of a man who had spent decades in a field where things turned out to be fakes, and who was now, unexpectedly, looking at the real thing. The estimated value was delivered to Carter in a brief, serious conversation near the back of the exhibition tent. The figure had 8 digits in it. Before auction commission, Carter thanked the expert and asked him to repeat it. The expert did. Carter thanked him again, walked outside, and stood in the parking area for several minutes looking at the hills. Madison had come because Xavier had sent her the address and the date and 3 words, "You need to be there," and she had come alone, wearing something she had not overthought, working her way toward the Ferrari's position from the far side of the hall. She saw the crowd around it first, then the red through a gap in the bodies, and then the car itself as the crowd shifted, and she stopped. The restoration was extraordinary. Even to Madison, who had no vocabulary for coachwork or provenance, the car communicated something. It was the color that hit her first Rosso Corsa, a red so resolved and particular that it seemed less painted than inherent, as if the car had always been exactly this color and the fire had been a temporary interruption. The proportions were different from anything she had associated with her childhood memory of the thing in the garage. Those memories had been of a damaged object, shapeless and embarrassing. This was a piece of design. This was something someone had made with care for a specific person. Then she saw the dashboard. She leaned across the velvet rope to see it clearly, and the security attendant took a polite step forward before Carter, who had come up quietly behind her, said it was all right. Along the lower edge of the instrument binnacle, worked into the trim in small inlaid lettering that required proximity to read, were 8 words. "For the road we'll take when you're ready." Madison stood up slowly. She recognized the phrase. It was something her father had said to her. She couldn't remember the exact occasion. Only the words themselves, which had lived in her memory without context for 20-odd years, orphaned from whatever meaning they had once carried. Xavier had stationed himself near the auction registration desk and was watching Madison with the attentive interest of someone waiting for a market to move. He worked his way over to her and began speaking in a low, persuasive murmur about the extraordinary opportunity the auction represented, the right bid, the right moment, reclaiming what was rightfully hers, the kind of chance that came once. Madison wasn't listening. She was looking at Carter. Carter let the silence hold for a moment, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded copy of the letter, a reproduction on plain paper, not the original, which was sealed in archival packaging, and held it out to Madison in silence. Madison took it. She read it standing beside the car in the crowded exhibition space. Slowly, the way you read something that is reorganizing things. When she finished, she stood with the letter in her hands, and her face did something that the rest of her had been carefully preventing for a very long time. She did not make a sound. But Carter saw it, and so did Ella, who had positioned herself quietly at his side, watching the woman who had once called their car a piece of junk with the same careful attention she gave to most things she was trying to understand. Xavier started speaking again. Carter turned and looked at him, and something in Carter's expression, not anger, not dismissal, just a kind of settled clarity, made Xavier stop. For a long moment, the 4 of them stood together beside the most important piece of machinery any of them had ever been near, and the noise of the exhibition moved around them like water around a rock. Madison asked Carter if she could buy the car back. She asked it plainly, without the architecture of an offer or a negotiation, and she said she didn't want it for the money. She knew what it was worth now, and that was not the point. She wanted it because it was her father's, and she understood now what her father had been trying to keep safe, and she wanted somewhere to put what she now knew. Carter said he needed to think about it, not buying time, but actually meaning it, and Madison heard the difference and nodded. She asked if she could give him a number anyway. Carter said the number wasn't the part he was thinking about. Madison looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of respect. That evening Carter sat at the small kitchen table in the back of the shop and was honest with himself about his situation. The figure the appraiser had quoted was enough to eliminate every financial pressure in his life and leave a substantial sum remaining. It was enough to move Ella out of the back of a commercial garage and into a house with a yard. It was enough to fund the kind of expansion that would turn Miller Restorations from a one-man operation surviving on reputation into a functioning business with proper equipment and employees. Carter was not unmoved by these facts. He was a practical man and he had a daughter, and practical men with daughters did not dismiss life-changing sums of money because of sentiment. But he also sat with what it would mean to sell. The car had come to him as a discarded thing, called worthless, by the person who should have known its value best. Carter had spent 9 months and most of his financial reserves restoring it not because he expected a return but because he had recognized something in it, the same quality he looked for in every car he brought into the shop, which was the quality of a thing that deserved better than what had happened to it. Selling it to the highest bidder at a collector auction would not be wrong. Exactly. But it would be a kind of incompleteness. It would leave the story without its ending. He called Madison the next morning and told her his answer, and it was not what she had offered and not what she had expected. The Meridian Classic Car Museum was a non-profit institution on the outskirts of Sacramento that specialized in vehicles with documented California histories. Carter had been in contact with their curatorial director for 2 months, since before the exhibition, since before the appraisal, laying the groundwork for what he now proposed formally. The Ferrari would be donated to the museum's permanent collection, where it would be displayed with full documentation of its commission, its history, the fire of 1981, the restoration, and the letter. The display would carry 3 names: Joseph R. Blake, Commissioner, Madison Blake, by descent, and Carter Miller, Restorer. The car would be seen by the public. The story would be told completely. No one would own it in the sense that isolated it from the world, and no one would be able to sell it. Madison was quiet for a long time after Carter finished. Carter waited. He had learned, over 9 months of a complicated project, to let silence do its work. Madison said she thought her father would have liked that. Carter said he thought so too. Xavier Coleman took the news the way people take news that removes their commission from a transaction badly. He contacted a collector publication and suggested, through a barely veiled source, that Carter had manipulated a grieving woman into surrendering her inheritance rights to a vehicle worth many millions by presenting forged documentation. The allegation was not especially credible, but it was precisely the kind of thing that generates noise in a community that runs on reputation. Carter was informed of it on a Tuesday evening by a friend in the collector network. He sat with it for about 20 minutes and then called Madison. Madison had already seen the insinuation circulating and had already drafted a response, which she sent publicly from her own name, with the specificity of someone who had prepared carefully and the authority of someone who did not need to raise her voice to be heard. She stated that the documentation was authentic, that she had examined the originals herself, that the restoration was extraordinary, and the decision to donate the vehicle was entirely consistent with her father's values, and that the individuals circulating contrary suggestions had been attempting to profit from the transaction and had been disappointed. It was precise and final, and it ended the conversation within about 24 hours. Ella asked Carter, that same evening, whether it was sad to give the car away. Carter thought about it and said it wasn't giving it away, it was giving it somewhere. There was a difference. Ella said she thought she understood the difference, that it was like returning a book to the library so other people could read it. Carter told her that was probably a better analogy than anything he had come up with. The Ferrari was installed in the Meridian Museum's featured gallery the following spring, in a light-filled space at the end of the main corridor, where it occupied its own platform beneath a repositioned skylight that allowed direct natural illumination. The display included photographs, documents, and a continuous audio presentation, but the centerpiece was the car itself, Rosso Corsa, fully restored, still carrying the ghost of the fire along the lower panels where Carter had deliberately left the metal with its history rather than erasing it entirely. The dashboard inscription was visible through the driver's window, readable if you leaned close and knew where to look. The opening was attended by people who had known Joseph Blake and people who hadn't, by restoration professionals who had followed the provenance story, and by one writer from a classic car journal who had spent 3 months researching the commission and published a long account of the car's complete history 2 weeks before the opening. Carter came with Ella, who wore her good shoes and asked the museum's head of collections 7 questions in 15 minutes that the woman later described as the most interesting conversation she had had at the venue in years. Madison came alone and stood for a long time in front of the car without speaking to anyone. Carter's shop changed in the year that followed. He received 4 major commissions from collectors who had heard about the Ferrari and wanted the same quality of attention applied to their own projects. He hired 2 additional mechanics, both young and both better than they knew, and spent a considerable amount of his time teaching rather than executing, which turned out to suit him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He moved into a house with a proper yard 6 blocks from Ella's school and kept the shop as a professional space rather than a home. Ella still had a desk there, and she still used it. Some things don't need to change just because circumstances improve. Madison's change was slower and less visible, which probably meant it was more real. She stepped back from the fashion import venture not dramatically, but with the gradual disengagement of someone who had realized that the project had been built on the need to put distance between herself and something, and that the something no longer required distance. She took a position on the board of a vocational education nonprofit and funded a program specifically focused on automotive restoration and fabrication, run out of a community facility in Sacramento. She attended the program's events and was occasionally useful, and sometimes, when she was watching one of the students work on something that required patience and precision, her expression had a quality that people who knew her found hard to name. Carter and Madison were not friends. Not exactly. They saw each other occasionally, at the museum, twice at events connected to the vocational program, once at a collector gathering in Monterey where they ended up at the same table by coincidence, and had a conversation that ran 2 hours without either of them noticing. They had the kind of relationship that is built not from shared interest or convenience but from shared participation in something that mattered, from having been present for the same difficult truth, and from having both behaved decently under conditions that did not require it. It was a rarer connection than most, and neither of them wasted energy trying to name it. A year after the museum opening, Ella stood in front of the Ferrari on a school visit. Her class had come on a field trip and Carter had been asked to speak briefly about the restoration. Ella waited until the other students had moved on to the next display and stood alone with the car for a moment, the way she had done in the driveway of the shop the first day it had arrived on the flatbed. She looked at the dash inscription through the glass. She had known what it said for over a year, but she read it again anyway. Then she turned to her father, who was waiting nearby, and asked whether he thought something that had been burned could really come back to what it was before. Carter looked at the car. He thought about the 18 months that had passed since the driveway of the Blake estate, about the letter in the floor pan, about the photograph of a young man standing beside his gift in California sunlight, about the small girl squinting beside him who had grown up into a woman carrying the wrong story for 30 years, about the night he had sat on the shop floor reading a dead man's explanation and feeling the weight of how much silence had been asked to hold. He looked at Madison, who was standing across the gallery with her hands in her jacket pockets and her attention on the car, on the inscription, on whatever it was she saw when she looked at it now. Then he looked back at Ella. He said, "It doesn't come back to what it was before. It becomes something more. It becomes the version that has a story." Ella thought about this for a moment and nodded, which was the closest she usually got to calling something right. The gallery held them all briefly in its clean light, the car on its platform, the letter in its frame, the names on the wall, and then the rest of the school group came back looking for Ella. And Carter straightened up, and Madison turned toward the exit, and the ordinary world resumed its forward motion, the way it always does and always must. What remained, and what would remain, was the record of what had been seen and what had been chosen. That value does not disappear simply because someone with authority calls it worthless. It waits. It waits for the person with enough patience to look twice,